It's not what we should think about, but how we should think about them, interconnecting them and realizing how we should act upon these theories.
In this case, I fully believe the concept of choice is really not something in our control.
Portrayed is completely different, two different stories, right?
The media, they tend to do the thinking for you. Hello, welcome to the second episode of Our Media Discourse. If you remember, in the first episode, we had discussed the theory of narcotizing dysfunction. Today, we are going to discuss another very interesting theory, which was put forward by Donald Shaw and Maxwell Malcolms way back in 1968. This theory addresses the issue with regard to the very basic concept of what is news. And joining me in this very interesting session, my two colleagues, Professor Angana Chakraborty and Shorima Das, and students of 4th SEM as well as 5th SEM. And we have Prashidda Chetri, Sharnob Sanyal, Titisha Shaha, Mansi Thapa, Ved Malay, and Srimanto Pramanik. And of course, behind the camera, we have Abhidan Subba. And we're very happy to have you all, and thank you so much for participating in this session. It's also going to be a good lesson for you in the field of practical media production. So first, we'd like to go to Prasiddha Chetri. Prasiddha, you must be aware about this concept of news value, and how certain events get prominence. So in the light of agenda setting theory, how would you analyze your understanding of the idea of the importance of news?
Thank you, sir, for this interesting question. Well, agenda setting theory. I think that there's 3 steps to this theory. First is the reality. Second is how the media portrays it. And third, how we perceive it. Now, I'll take a very common example. Suppose, sir, we had an accident over here, hypothetically. Hypothetically, we had an accident over at NGP. Just a minor accident, right, sir? Just between 2 people. Now, there are spectators over there, the witnesses, the pedestrians that watched the accident. Now, the media people will come in, they'll report on that accident. And now, this is where the magic happens. This is where agenda theory comes into play. What will actually happen in that accident and what has actually happened in that accident will be portrayed differently as to how the media will say. Since I just mentioned, in this hypothetical situation, there are 2 people. The accident happened in between 2 people. One will be the driver and another one will be the victim. Several media people will come in from different media firms. And now, one media firm will ask the questions to the one that did the accident, right? The main driver. They'll ask the story from his perspective, and he'll tell the story from his perspective. Now, obviously, he's not going to be truthful about the accident, now, is he? So he'll tell the story from his perspective. And then, second, the other media people will tell the story from the victim's perspective. Different media people will show the story from each perspective. However, when the stories are presented, this produces a sort of dilemma. When this dilemma is presented to the people that watch this news, they'll think of it differently. We know what happened in that accident and how the media will portray it is completely different, 2 different stories, right? But the way they are perceiving it, the way they are portraying that accident, it'll be quite different. Now, when the people that will watch it, they'll think something else of that accident. What if the victim got hurt in that accident? But they'll not say that. Since they are portraying it from the driver's perspective, they'll be like, oh, nothing happened to that victim. He just had minor scratches, this, that. But what if he had a fracture? Yes? Other people, the ones who have watched the news from the victim's perspective, what they'll do is, they'll perceive the story from his perspective and they'll be like, oh, this driver was drunken. Oh, this driver was always like this. This driver was always like that. When in reality, it could be something else. But no, people will do that. People will think differently of what happened in there. But what truly goes on, it's completely different. This is what agenda theory setting is all about. This is where a question arises. How can this be battled in a way? How can we balance perspectives so that We don't have any biases towards any of these people.
Yeah, thanks, Prashid, for your insightful statements. But one thing we should all realize is more than battling these trends, these dominant media trends. What is more important I'm happy that the very fact that you're realizing these trends itself shows that you are aware of what the media can do to you. In this context, I'd like to quote Stuart Hall, very leading prominent media scholar. In 1972, he came up with a theory of encoding, decoding. And somehow this concept was aimed at, sort of removing the delusion that the interaction between media and the audience was one-sided and predominantly on the media, on the mass media side, which is not exactly correct, because people interpret messages, they decode messages in their own specific context. So it's important to note what the media does to us, and it's also important to note what we do to the media, which is, I think, in this digital age, in this age of user-generated content, where the user gets a platform to to get back to voice back his or her thoughts, her perceptions, her feedback. So this question of media having a one-sided effect, which was a very common misconception in the early days of media theories, that as recent studies have very clearly outlined, they seem to be a bit simplistic. Okay. Now, going back to the theory actually outlines, it basically addresses the issue of selection and dissemination of news by the big corporate media houses. So, going back to the basics of the theory, what Maxwell Malcolms and Donald Shaw found out in 1968 was that the mass media do not necessarily work on the on the plain and apparently simple concept of news value. We all learned in our textbooks that events become news due to a certain range of, due to certain criteria. But it's not always so simple. So the theory actually points out that there is always a policy, an unwritten policy adopted by all media houses, big corporate media houses, which decide what sort of news are to be highlighted and what sort of news are to be downplayed. And this is where the concept of gatekeeping comes in. Because this gatekeeping concept is very intrinsically linked with agenda setting concept. Okay. Now, in this context, I turn to Sharnob, explain his ideas about the way the agenda setting theory sort of explains the way the media selects and disseminates news items. Over to Sharnob.
So, thank you, sir, for the question that you have asked me. Taking from Prasid's very morbid example of an accident, it quite makes me think that media in general is supposed to be like a medium of like free expression, but all it leads to is a very suffocating narrative, doesn't it? That makes me think, like, how does this even work? How does this suffocation permeate into our like biases, and how does it permeate into their biases, and like how do we interconnect? So understanding this and understanding the agenda setting theory, I would like to take I'd like to take the example of three models. Okay, these three models have been laid down as number one, the awareness model, number two, the priorities model, and number three, the salience model. Now, the awareness model is basically related to like this collective subconscious that every person has. It's called the theory of accessibility. Like, how much is a piece of information accessible to you from the get-go? Whenever you think of a topic, whenever you think of a very, very normal issue that has been going on, how much of it comes to your head, how much of it reoccurs in your head is very dependent on this model. So the awareness model basically states that when media talks about a certain problem or a certain issue, that issue gets precedence over everything in a person's mind. So it kind of, I believe that this is where the autonomy and the authority of media is established. Now, the second one, the priorities model, is where you start to kind of incorporate the audience. It kind of relates to the chicken or egg theory. Whose bias comes first, the audience or the media? So the priorities model is basically stated that everything is based on like a hierarchy of priorities. Whenever you get knowledge about something, you feel that knowledge and then you act upon that knowledge. Now, what is this knowledge decided by? Whether it's by precedence of what the media thinks events should be discussed in, or what we prioritize on what we usually want to see. Okay, this is the priorities model. The salience model is where I believe autonomy is returned to the audience. That even if a problem is portrayed by media, it's not necessary that the audience will pertain to it. It's not necessary that the audience will think about it to the extent that media does. This is where your choice comes into play. And regarding these theories, there can be a lot of like interweavings and inter-effects. For example, you can say that media agenda setting theory, depending on these three models, like work in like three levels, which is like the first level agenda setting, the second level agenda setting, and the third level agenda setting. The first level is basically them telling us like what exact topics to think about, what exact issues to think about, what exact problems to pique your interest about. The second part of this, the second set, is when like these agendas, they're like superseded by, how you should go about thinking of these things. It's not what we should think about, but how we should think about them. And the third is basically like interconnecting them and realizing how we should act upon these theories. I think these exist to be the fundamentals of what the theory acts to be and how we can understand. And as Prasid asks his question, how we can even like think about tackling this issue.
Thank you, Sharnav. Very eloquently explained. You talked about preferences. For instance, your preferences. How do the media, relate to your preferences? Now, you see, it's not just the media. It's the sort of, thinking space which you as students occupy, the way you grew up, the sort of society you live in, and the educational process which you went through. All these contribute to preferences. And now the media has a lot to do with it, because you see, if I were to ask someone from your generation, what was the favorite snack which you'd like to enjoy? And probably the first choice would be pizza. Maybe, even 25 years down the line, or 30, 35 years down the line, probably when we were in college, the first choice, say, for someone in Kolkata would have been quite different. Now, the big question is, how much are you actually making your choices? How much are these choices and preferences yours? Because the media, we live in a mediated world, as we discussed last time. And so the media, as some very strong critics of mass media have often explained, they tend to do the thinking for you. For instance, if I asked you, why is cricket so popular in India? And the answer would probably be that because the Indians love it. A big question, do the Indians love it? Or due to a long process of media coverage, and advertisement support, corporate support, the Indians have been led to a position where they have perhaps no other option but to love it. And remember, cricket is not our national game, it's hockey. So with this, we'd like to go to Titisha. Titisha, if you could, you have gone through the theory, the basics. Can you please explain, how do you relate to some of the assumptions made in this theory?
Thank you, sir, for your question. So I would like to talk about the cognitive process of accessibility. When a particular news report is given importance and attention, then the audience will automatically perceive it to be the most important. So in this case, the concept of choice is, I believe, a delusion, a dilemma we create in our heads to have that sense of control when we really do not. At least not to the extent that we believe we do. Responsibility of the media here is projecting a set topic through a lens that grabs the attention of the audience for maximum viewership, because of course the aspect of profit, due to which the audience begins to adopt these references of media and see the world through that said lens, and adopts a similar view of the world which may be completely opposite or not even near to the said reality. In this case, I fully believe the concept of choice is really not something in our control, and it is what is being imposed to us, what is being told is important, what is being fed to us. So I would like to ask a question back, and that would be, how do we as audience combat this? How do we as audience not side with these biases and see the world for what it truly is? So one more point that I would like to add is, oftentimes I feel like a lot of communities can be marginalized because of the same factor. Because of this factor where representation sort of turns into imposition of stereotypes. So how do we as audience again combat that and see things for what they truly are?
A very relevant and pertinent questions, Titisha, because somehow you have other theories which actually discuss this sort of this colonizing role of the corporate media. You have the theory of cultural imperialism, and even George Gardner, in his cultivation theory, he mentioned how the mass media sort of generalizations and simplifications, they try to portray a very monolithic and a homogeneous view of the world. All this results in certain political setups or nations or societies being seen or accepted as the norm, as the standard, while anyone, any society, any nation which is beyond the parameters of that norm, they appear to be somehow so different, so deviant, and the process of otherization begins, And there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on by the media, on especially the corporate media, and I think there's no prizes for guessing how powerful the media is, who actually owns the media, to really understand the degree of control which the media has on world politics, economics, and even the culture. For instance, we just compare like the Hindi film industry in Mumbai. I don't want to call it Bollywood. It's the Hindi film industry in Mumbai. It seems to be very popular, but it is nothing when compared to Hollywood. So that's just one form of cultural imposition, cultural imperialism, which the movie industry sort of exerts on the people of the world by the sheer size of its market. When you take all these factors into consideration, there's obviously no doubt that there's a lot of pressure on indigenous peoples, to somehow stand up to the expected norm of behavior and conduct, including lifestyles and even food. Okay. So really lots of questions here, and some of it beyond the scope of today's discussion, which is basically on the agenda setting theory. But I think this theory is just the first step. It's just the first step. It's the first step towards hegemony. This concept of hegemony, which explains the whole idea, this whole idea of dominance more explicitly and more clearly, right? So yes, maybe we'll discuss theory of cultural imperialism and Gramsci's concept of hegemony and cultural hegemony in the context of our media discussions, right? Okay.
Like, I want to talk about the thing that's happening right now, and we see happening a lot of times. Media actually portrays like topics which don't really have a significant importance in our lives. Like, they show things that people don't really want to see. They don't cover things people have an interest in. They chase more towards like views, what the public like wants to see. I mean, not in a developmental standpoint, but in like entertainment based. It's more entertainment based nowadays. They don't cover topics which needs to be covered. Like, a lot of things which need to be talked about are not being talked about, and stuff which are of no importance are being highlighted way more than it should be. That's all I want to say.
স্যার, আমি জানতে চাই যে এই যে তত্ত্বটা মানে কে কীভাবে ব্যাখ্যা করেছে তার সম্পর্কে আমি একটু জানতে চাই।
যেটা হচ্ছে যে বেসিক্যালি এই তত্ত্বর যে বিষয়টা, সেটা হচ্ছে খবর, যে সংবাদ, যে সংবাদ আসলে কি। তোমরা হয়তো পড়েছ যে সমস্ত সংবাদ কোনো ঘটনা, কিন্তু সমস্ত ঘটনা সংবাদ নয়। কিন্তু এই সংবাদের সংজ্ঞাটা কীভাবে তৈরি করা হয়, আমাদের ধারণা যে কিছু মৌলিক বিষয় থাকে, উপাদান থাকলে একটি ঘটনাকে আমরা সংবাদ হিসাবে বিবেচনা করতে পারি, কিন্তু আদতে কিন্তু সেটা হয় না। এটাই হচ্ছে এই তত্ত্বের মূল বক্তব্য, যে অনেকগুলো ব্যবসায়িক স্বার্থ, বড় বড় কর্পোরেট হাউসদের কতগুলি প্রফিট সংক্রান্ত বিষয় দ্বারাই স্থির করা হয় যে কী ধরনের খবর কে বেশি ভাবে দেখানো হবে, বেশি গুরুত্ব দেওয়া হবে, আর অনেক সময় অনেক গুরুত্বপূর্ণ খবরও থাকে যেগুলোর যেই ধরনের গুরুত্ব পাওয়া উচিত হয়তো সেই ধরনের গুরুত্ব প্রদান করা হয় না। তো এই বিষয়টিরই কি খুব গভীরভাবে উপলব্ধি করার চেষ্টা করেছেন ডোনাল্ড শ আর ম্যাক্সওয়েল ম্যাকমস 1968 সালে। এবং তাদের বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে বেশিরভাগ মিডিয়া কন্ট্রোল করে খুব বৃহৎ আকারের কর্পোরেট হাউসেস, এবং তাদের স্বার্থের দ্বারাই সিদ্ধান্ত নেওয়া হয় যে কী ধরনের খবরকে আমরা বেশি প্রচারে ফেলবো আর কী ধরনের খবরকে আমরা কিছুটা অতটা গুরুত্ব প্রদান করব না। তো এর সাথে যে জড়িত বিষয়গুলো সেগুলো এই তত্ত্বে আলোচিত করা হয়েছে।
Thank you, sir. It was quite an interesting conversation that we had. We all learned a lot about agenda setting theory and how it worked, how it influenced us, how the media dictates our day to day life. Now, sir, one of my first questions is that critical thinking, right? Absolutely important. But how important is it? And what can we do to bring it back? Who really is at fault over here? The media that portrays these types of news, or us, the consumers, who keep consuming these type of news and keep fueling their ambitions, keep fueling their motivations and everything else?
Okay, so pertaining to what the questions that Prasid have asked, I would like to give my own thoughts on like the two questions which he has asked. The first being how we should bring back critical thinking and how like it's influenced, and the second one is like who really is at fault here. Like, is it the consumerists or the ones who's creating the media? So for the first thing, I would like to bring in the concept of this thing called the availability heuristic. So heuristic is basically this principle that says that anytime we look at a very shortened segment of anything that's been portrayed, we like to make very quick mental judgments. We like to make very quick mental mappings. The heuristic theory states that if we look at a certain piece of information, we completely ignore all the processes and make a jump to a conclusion that suits us. And that is where I believe critical thinking is really important, because heuristical theory basically works in this way. Like, for example, you see like you could see that there's recently like no coverage on incidents that have been related to, like, let's say accidents or like badly maintained roads. So you'd probably start thinking like, yeah, you know what, maybe the roads have been fixed, maybe accidents are no more because roads are being maintained well. But that's not true. It's because they're not being covered enough. But you make judgments on something that's only available to you. That's really not critical thinking, is it? I think critical thinking is something that can be reinforced by like acknowledging that there's some gaps in information and not really making like very quick, cognitive relations between certain things. Now, of course, like what is his next question? Like, who's to blame? Like, who's to put in fault? I think fault really doesn't exist in a void, because I think like in a system that works basically between the interweavings between the consumerist and the creator, and the feedback and feedback and to certain events and like the retaliation to it, I don't really think like it's something that a certain particular body can be put to blame. I believe it's a very interconnected thing, like as I mentioned, it's a whole chicken and egg thing. Whose bias takes precedence first, whether it's us, whether it's them. So I believe that to counter this and like to put fault, I feel like I'll put fault to like awareness. I feel like both bodies and like people who consume these things should be aware to an extent about how these topics are consumed, how these topics are analyzed, how these topics are discussed, and how much further we go to like imposing them into the very roots of our beliefs. So yeah, I think on the basis of relation between the first two questions, I believe that we should definitely opt for some critical thinking, and we should stop pinning blame on an exact body, because it's a lot more than what it seems. It's a lot more than what's been shown to us. So for stacking something like that, I think being aware, being informed, reading up on topics from different perspectives, and also like researching them on your own is very important. Your own input is very important.
How do you escape the agenda? Now, this is, as you said, something very beyond the scope of, this particular theory, because it all boils down to what sort of society you live in, what is the governance, what is the political ideology which is running your country or your nation. To put it very simply, you have to look for or, recover spaces which you've lost. Some spaces which are available to us, our generations. And as the years roll along, I think the newer generations are increasingly losing spaces. About information consumption, for instance, do you really need to know everything about what is going on in the earth? I mean, as a media teacher, this is something, from a journalist, it's not necessary. For instance, you have a screeching breaking news. It's very distorted term of the word breaking news. The original meaning was breaking news, something which is really big. Anyways, we have the screeching headlines, breaking news, and what someone far away in a far away district, a bicycle was stolen and then recovered by the police or something like that, or someone eloped with someone. So these are trivial news, unless they really concern your locality. I wouldn't be interested in what was happening. And maybe a general idea about the condition and the criminal, the state of crime in the country. But I wouldn't be interested in knowing each and everything that is happening. Okay. So there has to be a connection, because you have to decide that what are the sort of news which is relevant to you. And we have this concept of, a very marginalized concept nowadays, this concept of development journalism. Means journalism which is linked to your real world existence. And, it's linked to your efforts, everyone's efforts to make your place on the world a better place. So I don't think, so once you recover those lost spaces, once you, move away from, excessive media consumption, and you maybe 1 hour in the morning or maybe 1 hour in the evening just to get a hang of what's happening around you. But then you have to go to your real lives, delve into your real lives, as we discussed the last, first edition of Media Discourse, create, rebuild communities, interact with each other, maybe pay a visit to the hospital or the court, the hospitals, marketplaces, courts. They're great places to, regain your footing with the real world. Okay, so yes, and since you are students of mass communication, mass media, I think you have a wonderful opportunity to be aware of what the media is doing to you, and then you would be probably in a better position to know how to escape the agendas and the propaganda and the misinformation, disinformation of the organized mass media as well as the social digital media.
What I believe is producers and consumers have a symbiotic relationship. They both feed off of each other and serve each other's interests. What we as audience can do is just try to get the full picture, because I believe the producers do have the full picture, but by the time it trickles down to us, it really turns into something else. It turns very black and white, when one is bad and the other one is good. We as audience need to get the full picture, need to really question and be curious and stay curious and try to find out more and more and more. And I feel at the end of the day, that's where critical thinking also comes into play.
All right, so that was a very interesting discussion. We could have continued, but for paucity of time, we now have to conclude the second edition of Our Media Discourse. We'll be back again maybe in 2 weeks' time with the third edition. It's a very learning and growing process for our students. And we really look forward to the next session. And before going, I'd like to thank our students, Prashita, Sharnab, Titisha, Mansi, Ved, and Shimantu, and my colleagues, Professor Angana Chakraborty and Shodima Das, as well as one of us senior students behind the camera, Abhidan Subba. With that, thank you for watching this episode, and please do send in your comments. Till the next episode, goodbye and have a good time.